let's look at the concept of continuous function and the concept of limits that arise here, starting from the scholarship. But the continuous function is indeed this function that changes without leaps, which is called a gap or in everyday language. Expressed, this is such a function of continuity that can be draw a graph that can be drawn without lifting the pen from the sheet of paper. And if it is necessary to tear it off, it means that the functions will already be continuous. These are the races that called discontinuities. The breaks are different. Yes, breaks of the first kind and breaks of the second kind. But really, if a lot was led by a hand with a pencil on paper, then we would have to tear off our point. Because at this point the function, although definite, but the meaning is different than here. This red calculation and point. Well, it's the same here. That is, on the basis of a gap, which is called a bridged gap, because in principle, we can define in any case, the function so that it was in the spring. First, it was necessary that the function was continuous. Well, there are more complex options. Discontinuities at infinity, but also the like, which we will talk about when we cross the limit. The definition of a continuous function is usually give through Alexander formula. This is the approach suggested by Baron Cauchy. I will not duplicate it. Well, really, this idea. The fact that we do not open the pencil to deception in order to write it down mathematical. So you have to resort to such concepts. Moreover, note that the continuous function is determined first for a specific point. That is, we are talking about a continuous separate function. Points in the spring, and then logically we already pass that the function is continuous on the interval. Well, here's how we draw a graph on a sheet of paper, yes on some interval of the function is continuous if it is continuous at each point of this interval. Well, let's now look at these concepts already alive. Let's try. I will duplicate the count, but this is the definition of continuity through the standards of the organism. Well, by and large it makes sense. Its next meaning is that if we take a small neighborhood of the point that we say, that is, we are talking about the continuity from the point in the spring. First we look at the point at which in this example I took, for example, this function, it is continuous everywhere, because the function in green can be used to define indicators continuous to any point. Let's fix a point on the base. For example, I took 1.5, you can take some other point. Well, really, if we take a small neighborhood, some of this point, here I am this neighborhood in using the same cult symbol and denoting the neighborhood. Belt that we are Jews all the time increasing the scale of us, looking at coming closer and closer and closer to this point to the left is not a. I left the graph in the usual one on the right. I'm looking at this rectangle, and I come to the point I gave this spring. Left and right. And what happens to me, if I strive for a point, then it also tends to this point from them. Look again. Let me take less wow. That is, it is the distance from the forest left and right and now on an even larger scale, even despite this function. Well. And further, getting closer and closer to the point, I will observe this. That is, when I approach the USA, the function is and so to strive for meaning. That is, it is supposed to pay attention to it, when we talk about continuity, that the function of a certain this point, that is, first of all, the function must exist at this point, at which it speaks and, well, with a simpler language, expressed when approaching this point in terms of their sum and the game of approaching the same point. Let's now see. And the Prime Minister says, let's bring functions that are no longer continuous. Let's all this is the first control design, so as not to screw up. Here are these top examples. Same. The same is about. Let me. They'll take a little of my functions. I will divide another example into something. Not for anything. And on. Something that I have at some point of continuity of it, for example, for sex for money. Why? I'm comfortable and -1. See, I have charts. Pass through this zero at the point of their country to unite. This means what I mentioned. I can also present it as a minus. Root 1 root retire, false, on a democratically appropriate function. Now this is how my function will look like. Yes, let's make my culture bigger. See? When the function approaches a point, in this case there are still two of them. I have the same one. I did not transfer everything either and left the function as an example. Looking at the function at the same point, least-based arguments. And where it is bad, and it will be bad where and all the same units. Here we play. Nothing bodes well that it will be bad. In fact, this is so, because you cannot divide by. If the signs are unity, then there is a function and such a point is so equal. Unit will be indefinite. Let's see. They will take one. Really. You see, there are no facts in the spring, because the expression is divisible by. Accordingly, we see that we cannot postpone the same thing on the graph simply due to the fact that it does not exist, and, accordingly, because of this, there is no continuity. Then, if we took our hand with a pencil, reached this point, but there is nothing here, as if the way out and the point is so interesting, and so here is the Prime Minister and in the category it is better at some point, when doctors to him, for example, let's not 1 2, everything is fine here. Functions not first point. Units. Destroyed means continuity. No, if you consider the definition of continuity, then here. Well, it's just not fulfilled by virtue. That their attacks with me do not exist. And there may be more like other options. For example, we can, as a variant of the Aryan, define the factors of the main, say. Which and how is it boiling? Yes, we have been drawn to find we again in the open now transmits. Seems to be a rip-off feature. Here we will show how the conditions at this point, the points of their function are defined. It has a different meaning. Why is there such a gap? Called the country? Because we can define this here in the spring, and then everything will be fine. How it is possible, without taking off a pencil and paper, to put it on a schedule? Look. Now a definition, but it is rather cumbersome. Continuity, and often it's biological, is divided into two parts. Defines a continuous function through the limit of the function of the survey point. The limit of their point with a new function is, well, roughly speaking, such a value to which tends facts when we drove them to this point. It is important here that to say that here, when we talk about the limit, we no longer require that exactly at the point at which we look at the points. In the spring, the function itself was definitely there. It can be indefinitely a point, but we can determine the limit, and it can be defined as the general limit, which is on the left, which is on the right. Should be the same. It turns out the value to the same number of victims of attacks tends to both the left and the right. It happens, defines the limits, calls appointed by a minus or a politician, when from the left to one strive for this value, reprisals have shaken off. If we go in, who strives for another? This them again. As far as discontinuities of the first kind are concerned, we are, as it were, the first discontinuities of the second kind. They are tied, yes, by explanation to the notion of a limit. Is it kind of a gap where the limit doesn't exist? Or is it to infinity? Yes, infinity leaves when they say that the limit is minus infinity. How does the left limit minus infinity? The right is adhered to infinitely, or at this point does not know the limit at all. In this example, the right side alter plus infinity, the left-hand side is functioning faster. Faster does not exist at all, does not tend to anything. And then if the limit exists and is equal to the function, the value of the function at this point, then the definition is obtained equivalent. That is, the same definition has been rewritten a little differently. On the one hand, it is additional, requires the introduction of the concept of a limit. On the other hand, it seems to be achieved in two parts and it becomes more understandable now. Once again, when we talk about continuity, we require that the functions, points in the spring were definitely. That is, if you existed again, when we talk about the limit, they are these limits, then we do not require in order for them to exist. The meaning of the function here is written with candles. Let's now see the same definitions. Yes, they are rewritten here in the limit. Hence, the functions are assigned in such a way when they tend to the layer and the limit of the function. Well, this number is the definition of the limit. I will not reiterate, but the definition of continuity through the limit too. Let's take as another example. Let's look at a function, for example, one that is just the limits at a point. In this case all the same almost does not exist, but does not exist at all. There is a limit. Limit is equal to infinity. It is continuous, but the limit, says radial infinity. Well, this is a gap of the second kind, and the function itself is for example, it is taken indefinitely at this point.